Picture this, a 19-year-old girl alone in the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, practicing how to place her head on an executioner's block. She's rehearsing her own death, determined to die with grace rather than terror. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This is the true story of Katherine Howard, the fifth wife of England's most notorious king, Henry VIII. What could a teenager possibly do to deserve such a brutal fate? The answer will shock you because Katherine's real crime wasn't what history books tell you. Her crime was being young, beautiful, and vulnerable in a world where powerful men saw women as nothing more than pawns in their deadly games. I'm about to take you into the darkest chapter of Tudor England, where innocence was a luxury no one could afford, where love was a death sentence, and where a king's wounded pride could destroy anyone who dared to make him feel foolish. Katherine Howard's story isn't just about royal scandal. It's about how a broken system destroyed a young woman whose only mistake was trusting the wrong people. Before we dive deeper into this tragic tale, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. These historical stories take incredible research to bring to you accurately, and your support helps us uncover more untold tales from history's darkest corners. Let me paint you a picture of England in the year 1540. Imagine a country gripped by fear, where neighbors spied on neighbors, where a whispered conversation could lead to your head on a spike. Henry VIII had already broken with the Catholic Church, dissolved monasteries, and executed 2 wives. The royal court had become a snake pit of competing families, each trying to survive by destroying their rivals. Into this nightmare world stepped the Howard family, one of England's oldest noble houses. They had already gambled once with Henry's matrimonial madness. Their daughter Anne Boleyn had paid the ultimate price when she failed to give the king a son. Now, incredibly, they were willing to risk another young woman from their family. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, looked at his young niece Katherine and saw opportunity. She was everything Henry craved, young, vivacious, and seemingly innocent. The king, now approaching 50, was desperate to feel young again. His current wife, Anne of Cleves, repulsed him. He called her his Flanders mare and refused to consummate their marriage. Katherine Howard was born around 1523 into a world that viewed women as breeding stock. When her father died, she was shipped off to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. What should have been a safe haven became the scene of Katherine's first tragedy. The Duchess's household was chaos. Old, distracted, and more interested in her own affairs than supervising the young women in her care. She allowed Katherine to share living quarters with older girls who introduced her to dangerous games of love and seduction. At 13, Katherine began a relationship with her music teacher, Henry Mannix. Think about that for a moment. A grown man in a position of trust taking advantage of a child. By today's standards, this was clear abuse. But in Tudor England, Katherine would later be blamed for seducing him. When that relationship ended, Katherine immediately fell into the arms of Francis Derham, a gentleman in the Duchess's household. Their relationship was serious enough that they called each other husband and wife, exchanging gifts and promises. Many believed they were secretly married, a fact that would later be twisted into evidence against her. The dormitory at Horsham became a playground for secret romances and whispered confessions. Katherine learned skills that would later destroy her. How to conduct clandestine relationships, how to write love letters, how to keep secrets. The very experiences that should have been protected by responsible adults became weapons that would be used against her. By 1540, Katherine had caught the eye of the king. Picture Henry at this point in his life, massively overweight, suffering from infected leg ulcers that made him smell so bad, people could barely stand to be near him, prone to violent mood swings that terrified his courtiers. And yet, this teenage girl seemed to find him attractive. The Howard family orchestrated Katherine's rise with calculated precision. They secured her a position as maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, putting her directly in Henry's path while he was desperately seeking to escape his current marriage. Katherine's youth and apparent innocence provided a stark contrast to the foreign queen Henry was desperate to divorce. Henry's courtship was both pathetic and terrifying. Here was one of history's most powerful men, showering gifts on a teenager convinced that her youth could somehow restore his own. Katherine, with no understanding of the political forces manipulating her life, found herself the object of obsessive royal attention. The speed of events should have been a warning. Within weeks of his annulment from Anne of Cleves being finalized, Henry married Catherine in July 1540. A 19-year-old bride was marrying a man nearly 30 years her senior, whose previous wives had met fates ranging from annulment to execution. The early months seemed successful. Henry appeared happier than he had been in years, reinvigorated by his young wife's apparent affection. He showered Catherine with jewels, including pieces that had belonged to his executed wives. The macabre recycling of these treasures spoke volumes about his callous attitude toward the women he had discarded. Catherine embraced her role as queen with youthful enthusiasm. She delighted in the ceremonies, the beautiful clothes, the power to intervene on behalf of prisoners. Her compassionate nature initially endeared her to many at court. But the very qualities that attracted Henry also made her vulnerable. Her youth and inexperience made her an easy target for manipulation, while her natural warmth was misinterpreted as flirtation by men who saw opportunity in her accessibility. Meanwhile, Henry's health was deteriorating rapidly. His leg ulcers had become so infected that the smell was noticeable to everyone around him. These physical ailments contributed to violent mood swings that made him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. The pressure on Catherine to become pregnant quickly was enormous. Henry's desperate need for a male heir had already cost 2 wives their lives. Every month that passed without conception created more anxiety and suspicion. Then came the attraction that would destroy her. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, was everything Henry was not. Young, attractive, vital. He had regular access to the royal apartments through his position, and he used this access to pursue a relationship with the Queen that both knew was potentially fatal. Their secret meetings were facilitated by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who had survived the destruction of the Boleyn family only to involve herself in another queen's downfall. Jane should have known better than anyone the dangers of royal scandal, yet she willingly served as go-between for the clandestine romance. Catherine's letters to Culpeper, written in her own hand, would later become key evidence against her. Her words, "It makes my heart to die, to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company," revealed not just romantic feelings but a level of intimacy that could be interpreted as treasonous. The meetings took place everywhere. The Queen's private chambers, secluded spots during royal progresses. They used coded messages and trusted intermediaries to arrange encounters. These precautions, while necessary for safety, also provided evidence of premeditation that would later condemn them. What drove Catherine to such reckless behavior? Perhaps it was the natural rebellion of youth against an intolerable situation. Perhaps it was genuine love for a man her own age. Or perhaps it was simply the human need for affection and companionship that her marriage to Henry could never provide. The walls began closing in during October 1541. John Lascelles, a religious reformer, approached Thomas Cranmer with devastating information about Catherine's past. His sister had worked in the Dowager Duchess's household and witnessed Catherine's earlier relationships. Cranmer faced a terrible choice: report potential treason and risk another royal execution, or remain silent and potentially face his own death for concealing it. He chose to present the information in a letter, allowing Henry to read the accusations privately. Henry's initial reaction was disbelief and rage. He couldn't accept that his young wife, who seemed to adore him, could have deceived him so completely. But as more evidence emerged, disbelief transformed into the cold fury that had marked his previous marital scandals. The investigation that followed was conducted with methodical brutality. Francis Derham and Henry Mannix were arrested and tortured until they confessed to their relationships with Catherine. Thomas Culpeper's arrest followed, and under torture he admitted to private meetings with the Queen while denying that their relationship had been consummated. Catherine's imprisonment began on November 14, 1541. The Queen, who had commanded the resources of an entire kingdom, was now powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of her daily routine. She was denied writing materials, prevented from communicating with anyone outside her immediate household, and subjected to constant interrogation. Her emotional state deteriorated rapidly. Witnesses reported that she alternated between periods of hysteria and catatonic silence. The young woman struggled to understand how her private relationships could be transformed into evidence of treason against the crown. The legal machinery moved with ruthless efficiency. Parliament was summoned to pass a bill of attainder against Catherine, condemning her without trial. This legislative process bypassed normal judicial procedures, allowing Henry to avoid any formal hearing where Catherine might have presented a defense. The charges were carefully crafted, concealing previous relationships before marriage, committing adultery with Thomas Culpeper, and conspiring against the king's life through treasonous conduct. The evidence included tortured confessions, her letters to Culpeper, and testimony from servants who had witnessed their secret meetings. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham faced their own trials and condemnations. Culpeper was granted the mercy of simple beheading, while Derham suffered the full brutality of a traitor's execution. Jane Boleyn presented a unique problem because she appeared to have suffered a complete mental breakdown. Parliament solved this inconvenience by passing a special statute declaring that madness was no defense against treason. Catherine's transfer to the Tower of London on February 10, 1542, was the beginning of her final act. She was confined in the same rooms that had held Anne Boleyn 6 years earlier, a deliberate psychological torture emphasizing the fate awaiting unfaithful queens. Her behavior during these final days surprised many who had known her only as a frivolous young woman. Faced with certain death, she displayed remarkable dignity and composure. She spent her time in prayer, reading religious texts, and preparing herself spiritually for what awaited her. Catherine's most haunting request was for the executioner's block to be brought to her room so she could practice placing her head correctly. This macabre rehearsal was motivated by her desire to die with dignity rather than the hysteria that had marked some previous royal executions. Her final letters expressed genuine remorse while maintaining innocence of the most serious charges. She acknowledged failing to disclose her past relationships before marriage, but denied committing adultery as queen or conspiring against Henry's life. On February 12, 1542, Catherine was told her execution would occur the following morning. She spent her final night in prayer and meditation, refusing food but accepting spiritual comfort from attending priests. Her composure during these final hours would be remembered as the most admirable aspect of her short, tragic life. The execution on February 13, 1542, was conducted with grim efficiency. Scheduled for dawn to minimize witnesses, Catherine was led to the scaffold within the tower's walls, the same location where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. Dressed in black velvet and white coif, Catherine approached the scaffold with steady steps and no visible fear. Her practiced positioning on the block demonstrated the care she had taken to prepare for this moment. Her final speech was brief, following traditional formula, acknowledging offenses against the king, requesting prayers for her soul, and forgiving those who brought about her destruction. The French executioner completed his work with a single stroke. Katherine Howard died instantly. Her suffering ended after months of imprisonment and psychological torture. She was buried immediately in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel. The aftermath reverberated through English society. Parliament quickly enacted new laws making it treasonous for any woman to marry the king without first disclosing her complete sexual history, revealing the paranoia underlying Henry's relationships with women. Henry's reaction was characteristically callous. Rather than expressing remorse for his teenage wife's death, he blamed her entirely for deceiving him, portraying himself as the victim while ordering the judicial murder of a 19-year-old girl. Katherine Howard's story reveals the systematic oppression of women in Tudor society, where women's bodies and sexuality were treated as political commodities, subject to constant surveillance and control. Her tale illuminates how youth and beauty could elevate a woman to the highest position in the land, only to become instruments of destruction when they failed to serve male ambitions. Modern historians increasingly view Catherine not as a promiscuous adulteress who brought about her own destruction, but as a victim of systematic abuse, beginning with inappropriate relationships as a teenager and culminating in judicial murder at her husband's hands. The question of Catherine's actual guilt remains contentious. While her past relationships are documented, evidence for adultery with Culpeper is less conclusive. Her letters, while intimate, don't explicitly admit physical adultery, and Culpepper's tortured confession may have been designed to minimize rather than accurately report his crimes. The legal procedures used to condemn Katherine have been universally criticized as perversions of justice, denying basic rights to defense and due process. The use of parliamentary attainder rather than judicial trial, acceptance of testimony extracted under torture, and creation of new laws specifically to ensure conviction all demonstrate the arbitrary nature of Tudor justice when serving royal purposes. Katherine's early relationships with Manox and Derham constituted statutory rape by modern standards. Her later behavior as queen can be understood not as evidence of inherent promiscuity but as predictable results of childhood trauma and exploitation. Her enduring story reflects both inherent drama and continuing relevance to contemporary discussions about power, consent, and justice. Katherine Howard's brief life and violent death serve as a window into a world where youth and beauty could become instruments of destruction when they failed to serve male desires. Katherine Howard stands as one of history's most tragic examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely and how innocence can be destroyed by forces beyond understanding or control. Her fate reminds us that behind every historical statistic lies a human being whose suffering deserves remembrance, not as entertainment but as warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of those who lack power in societies viewing them as expendable. In the end, Katherine Howard was a teenager who died for love in a world that had no room for genuine human emotion among its ruling class. Her story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal themes of youth destroyed by cynical age, innocence crushed by political ambition, and love punished by those who had forgotten what it meant to feel anything beyond the pursuit of power. Her legacy lives on not in the crown she briefly wore, but in the courage she showed facing death and the humanity she maintained, even as those around her reduced her to nothing more than a political inconvenience to be eliminated. Katherine Howard deserves to be remembered not as Henry VIII's foolish fifth wife, but as a young woman who paid the ultimate price for daring to seek happiness in a world determined to deny it to her.